Chris Ferris from Coposit. Welcome.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
It's good to have you, mate. And it's a really, really interesting time to speak to you because of what's happening in the market. So before we jump into kind of the Coposit journey, I wanted to elaborate on your journey and your experience as a developer.
Okay.
Tell us a little bit about your journey in property development and how you see property development at the moment, particularly in Sydney and New South Wales.
Well, thanks again for having me on the show. I think in terms of property development, it's evolved rapidly over the years, hasn't it? When I first started, so I left school, studied accounting, worked for Deloitte, and were able to get into the property development space. For about 10 odd years, I was developing apartment developments. Finished up developing about 3 to 4 years ago, and my God, has it changed since then. Some of the interesting parts of development, when you're talking with apartment developments, I mean, my main role was the acquisitions, the pre-sales, and the finance component of the development side. My brother, who's still my business partner, focused on the construction and the DA side, so pretty much all the hard stuff. I done all the fun stuff. We saw a lot of the problems firsthand people face, on the pre-sale side when trying to get into the property market and how difficult it is, and it's only getting harder. Not to say that it's impossible. I think there's a lot of stories at the moment out there saying it's impossible to get into property, but It's absolutely not. I'm sure we'll probably come back to that.
Yeah, sure.
But in the property development space itself, it's evolved rapidly with what product offering people want in terms of how people get into the property market, the lending space altogether on the construction lending side, that's changed rapidly and continuously changes. We're fortunate enough to deal with a lot of the bank and non-bank lenders in the Coposit business itself. In fact, we deal quite heavily with the bank and non-bank lenders and get a good idea of what's happening in market. It is very competitive in the finance space about construction loans itself.
Tell me why it's hard. Tell me why a smart person like yourself that goes to a big accounting firm, global firm, working families, successfully developing property, what makes it difficult? Because the misconception out there is that developers are these big, greedy people sitting on big profits. Wind back and peel a little bit as where the difficulties are.
Yeah, look, in terms of the profits, they do make profits. And most jobs, they do. In the last probably 4 to 5 years, if you ask some developers, they probably say that they haven't been making as much profit, if at all. They've been working for free on some of these projects because of feasibility, to be honest, an overhang still from COVID and availability of labor and construction materials. But I think if I was to start my development journey today, as opposed to 13 years ago, it would be a very different way to start. It was just myself and my brother. We had investors with us and a bit of a team. Now that sort of small structure is very difficult to actually operate within the market. And we were a builder developer at the time. Being a builder developer 13 years ago, or even 8 years ago, was seen by the banks to be not favorable. Whereas today, the builder developer model is seen as the most favorable model for a developer because they take out the builder risk, an external builder being appointed. Those margins that builder might make and the control of the project is actually within that developer now. So it's one entity that financier is having to look into fund.
Is apartment development challenging because the market doesn't want the product, the finished product, or because the cost to build the product is too expensive?
The cost is a huge problem. And I think the market does want the product. However, there's a cap as to how high they can pay for that particular product. To give you an example, the final project that we did, which was in Seven Hills here in New South Wales, if we were to do that project today, we would not be able to get that project out of the ground. Now, as an example, we sold an average price of say $620 for between the 1s, 2s, and 3 bedroom apartments. Today, maybe it's gone up a little bit. It's gone to $650, but the cost to deliver that property would outweigh the benefit to actually develop it. So we wouldn't be able to actually turn a profit on that project. We probably wouldn't be able to get construction funding to get that project out of the ground. And it'd be we wouldn't be able to get that project done.
What's the biggest cost variable? Is it people, materials, planning, funding? Is it all? Or is there one thing that really stands out to you that's been a big shift?
There's been a 50% increase from when we finished that job back in 2020. There's been at least a 50% increase in the cost of construction. Tie that in with the delays with getting DA approvals and approvals from council, or if you're lucky enough to be able to get into state government for approvals. Those holding costs just chew into your margins and you can't actually get these projects started. So those same projects today are not feasible for us, for example, as a developer. Now, in what I experienced with Coposit as a CEO and founder of Coposit, I'm fortunate enough to, we have over 100 live projects across the Eastern Seaboard on the platform. And I'm fortunate enough to be able to see a good cross-section of what's happening in the market. And the feasibility component is still the major issue to get projects out of the ground. Does the project stack? It's all my costs and my land cost. Am I able to turn a sufficient profit to not only actually make money, But for the bank to be happy to actually fund that project, is there sufficient buffer from a finance perspective to actually get that project funded? So these are some of the issues that we're seeing across market, and that is still happening at the moment. In my personal belief, I think it's still an overhang from COVID. I mean, we shut everything down. We smashed all the industry within a 3-month period, right? There was some suburbs, for example, that were completely locked out, expecting that the industry would recover within weeks or months. But it takes years to get the industry back on track. And that's what we're seeing. We're still seeing the overhang of construction costs, and that's from a material cost perspective. And then on the other side, we're seeing an availability of labor, which I believe is easing, but still an issue. It might be easing, but the cost of labor is still incredibly high.
So do you think we are now flatlining in terms of costs, or is there scope for them to come down? Is there any chance for them to come down, or that's out of the question and it's just about them flatlining and catching up?
Look, I don't think we ever really see costs come down materially enough to get your project back up and running. Like, for example, that project in Seven Hills, I don't think you'd see if it's gone up 50%, I don't think it's going to come back down equivalent percentages, which would be different, enough to get that project out of the ground. I think what needs to happen is an uplift in prices. But again, that then plays into the affordability and housing supply issue, that there's a cap on how much people can actually afford to purchase. And that's where, is a property, today to get that property again in Seven Hills up and running, it would need to be a $750,000 apartment cost. Now, can people actually afford to pay $750,000?
Yeah.
There's a house in Seven Hills going for $900,000, $950,000. At what point do you look at that and go, well, why am I getting a 2-bedroom apartment when I could get a house? The replacement cost to build that same property is through the roof. So you can't actually get those projects out of the ground.
Now, run me through Coposit, how this journey and this evolution has come into trying to solve that pain point, the affordability, and what are you seeing in terms of demand out there in the market for what people actually want to buy?
Yeah, absolutely. The Coposit came as a response to the issues that purchasers face when trying to get into the market. So typically with off-the-plan properties, a traditional deposit, and I call it tradition because we're breaking traditions here, is you have a 10% deposit. So you save, could be 2 years, could be 5 years, could be 10 years. You save for a 10% deposit. In the off-the-plan space, you put that 10% deposit down. It usually sits in a trust account, which nobody gets to utilize. And it could be a 2 or 3 year period to build that property. And then at the end, you settle with your 10% deposit. But there's that 2 or 3 year period where we said, well, why don't we allow people to use that period to save for their deposit?
Mm-hmm.
So what we did was we said, look, let's get in with a $10,000 deposit. So instead of having the full 10% deposit up front, start with $10,000 and you make weekly payments during the construction process in order to get to a full 10% deposit come completion. So I don't personally believe in low deposit options. I know there's probably some people out there that use them, but they have dangers if a market falls or if you can't have affordability, can't afford to make those repayments. So we still ensure that we get people to a higher 10% deposit, but utilizing that construction period and getting people highly engaged through our process.
And in terms of demand, so it's, you're providing a platform and a way for them to stage in to their investment. In terms of actually what they're buying, what are the things that people want to buy and what are the things that people are shying away from?
Yeah. Look, we have apartments, house and land packages, land only, or townhouses on the platform. We see demand across section. It's predominantly apartments because that's what is mainly getting delivered at the moment. We see a high demand for, at the moment, that sub $800,000 property is very difficult to deliver. We're seeing quite a few developers trying to get to that point, but the issue is that replacement cost that we talked about earlier. There would be a massive demand for sub $800,000 properties. And we're seeing that throughout our platform, that people that indicate they want to buy between 500 and a million, that is a very high percentage. It's probably over 35% of our buyers want to buy in that range. But then on the other end of the spectrum, there's probably 20% of our purchasers that want to buy above a $2.5 million property.
Okay.
Which is really interesting because you think Coposit, great for a first-time buyer, which it is. We created Coposit for first-time buyers.
Yep.
But because it's completely free for buyers to utilize, we're seeing investors utilizing the platform, downsizers utilizing it. They don't want to sell their property today. They'd rather keep their house and cash flow themselves out. And we're also seeing owner-occupiers wanting to buy, an investment property through that process.
What about 1s, 2s, 3s, and so the floor plan, kind of what stands out to you as preference, and also geographically?
Yep.
Where are the markets that are kind of hotter than others?
Yeah, I think people still want to live in very well-located areas. So if it still has, back in the development days, we used to concentrate on the 3 S's, so schools, shops, and station.
Yep.
These are the three amenities, and there's a lot more, but they're the primary amenities that people look for. If you've got kids, you're looking at the schools. If you're going to work into the city, you want to go on good transport hubs and getting in there quickly. And you obviously need to have shops around the location. So people are still looking for the amenity-based projects. I still think personally there still is the element of the great Australian dream. It's probably shifted where it's not a quarter acre block anymore, but there still is the elements of people want that house and land. But could be a potential that they're looking at apartments as an alternative way to get into the market. It's seen as an affordable way to get into the market. And from my perspective, I think a lot of people potentially look at property as their end goal straight away, whereas you should be looking at property as stepping stones to get to your end goal. It's not looking at, I want to be living in that $3 million property. How do I get to that point straight away? With property, you've always got to take a long-term view. And I've always taken a long-term view personally with property to actually get in stepping stones. So not going to the final property that you're wanting today straight away. It's probably not even possible, particularly if you're in the Sydney region or even Queensland at the moment, which is going, the hubs of Gold Coast and Brisbane are going through the roof in terms of pricing.
Are they still hot? Is Queensland still hot?
Gold Coast itself is still hot.
Yeah.
It's probably coming off the boil as opposed to 6 months, but I mean, to me, it's, when I say coming off the boil, it's probably still at 90 degrees. So it's still pretty hot.
What's been your biggest surprise as an investor in the past year from what you've seen in the market and your vantage point talking to a lot of different stakeholders? What surprised you?
Probably even beyond 1 year. I mean, when I started this journey 4 or 5 years ago, I found out that the average age of a first home buyer is 36.
Mm-hmm.
So when I personally look at that, when in the 80s and the 90s, it was 24 and then 28 respectively, I look at that trend and I think that's probably the biggest risk that the actual Australian economy generally has is the rising first home buyer rate. To me, when that age gets to 40 or 41, we've got serious societal problems that people can't actually get into property. And then you've got someone that's working for 20 or 23 years before they can actually buy a property, if that's what their objectives are. So for me, the real key motivator for me is I want to see that 36 age drop down. And there hasn't been a successive generation that's been able to out-purchase.
It's getting worse, right?
It's getting worse.
It's getting worse. And we're heading into an election and there's two kind of proposals on the table at the moment. The Labor scheme, which is a shared equity scheme, and the Liberal solution, which is taking 50 grand out of your super and using it as a deposit.
Yes.
How do you view those? I mean, you've got your feet on the ground. You're working with clients and developers. Which of those two sounds more sensible, or are they both nonsense?
Look, taking money out of super, it's designed, it's at the 12% effectively now, or coming up to 12%. So it's a substantial amount that people have for a 40-year, I'd call it compulsory saving account, right? The super one, pulling money out of super can be controversial. I think the problem that I have with both schemes is that they're both going to be inflationary. They're not going to address the underlying issue that housing is always going up. And in fact, controversial opinion is probably the government doesn't want property to go down. Mm-hmm. It's not a popular opinion. It's not good politics if property is going down. So I think the biggest challenge that government has, whether it's Liberal, Labor, whoever is in, the biggest challenge that government has is how do you appease one group of voters who wants to keep the property market propped, but appease the other growing and substantially growing group of buyers who can't get in, the other voter base who can't get into property, but want to get into property.
Yeah.
And that age is going from 28 to 36 to probably going, how do you appease that large group or that large cohort of buyers without property coming down? That's the challenge, because they need to maintain property for this voter base.
That's right.
But for this voter base, they actually need them to get in an affordable way. So they can't afford the $1.5 million.
And they're just doing nothing. That's why we keep talking about 6, 7, 8 years in, and all that's happening is that person's going from 32 to 34 to 36 years old now. Correct. Before they can buy their property. I think I'd like to get your perspective on this, because you know what you're talking about, and it's foreign investors. A big base of people that are in this country that don't vote are temporary residents.
Yes.
And at the moment, they're discouraged from investing in Australia. And I think that is one of the biggest consequences, because these people buy properties as investments, and those investments become rentals.
Correct.
And they help developers with feasibilities, and that supply addresses prices. What's your perspective on foreign investors?
Look, anyone that's been involved in large scale off the plan projects knows how important overseas or foreign investors are into getting those projects out of the ground. So I think the lack of large projects, and I'm saying probably call it 200 to 2,000 sort of property projects, call it an apartment project of 1,000. The importance of foreign buyers to get those big projects out of the ground is super important. I think the stats are with foreign buyers is less than 1% that is buying foreign property. So it probably makes for really good politics to say, let's ban foreign buyers. However, I do believe that we should be prioritizing Australians first in terms of home ownership, but there's got to be a way where we can do it better. So at the moment, foreign buyers, apart from the ACT, I think you'll probably have better information than me on that, are charged somewhere, anywhere from 10 to 14% additional stamp duty on top of how much, the existing stamp duty they have to pay. So it's a big disincentive.
You can take your money to Dubai and they give you a residency permit and they encourage you to bring their money. You bring your money as a foreign investor to Sydney, for example, and you're penalized. An 8% surcharge costs you 150 grand in stamp duty to buy $1 million property, even if you want to rent it out to a long-term tenant.
Yeah.
So I think there's something fundamentally broken there. And ever since we stopped foreign investors through surcharges, the amount of supply has come off. Absolutely. And the rental crisis has become worse.
A good example of that is in Docklands, in Vic. There was some massive projects there that got out of the ground. There were substantial foreign buyers in those projects. But if you look at Docklands, potentially the price growth hasn't happened there.
Yep.
Right? But what the effect of that massive supply increase over the last 10 years has happened is that it's kept rentals in check. It's kept it lower. It's made it affordable for people, for first-time buyers to actually go into that market. They can still save while paying $300 or $400 a week rent, which is probably a lot higher now. So they can still save for a deposit and get into the market. If that supply wasn't there, the rents in Docklands would be through the roof, and people wanting to live there and work there wouldn't be able to save for a deposit. So that's an example of good policy where they had foreign buyers in those projects and they were able to get that project out of the ground faster. And even as of today, there's a good amount of supply in the Docklands region.
That's right. It's a nice place to live too.
It's a nice place to live. I was actually there the other day. And there's employment coming there. I know ANZ have their head office within Docklands, which is 10,000 odd team members within that space. But it provides opportunity, but it keeps prices in check. So
That's
I think
right.
without having those initial foreign buyers, and I'm not saying open it up to 30% of buyers, foreign buyers, but I think there needs to be, we have this tendency to just cut things off. Whereas maybe we can look at have different caps and different ways. Whereas the shared investment scheme, I don't know about you, like talking on the other policy, I don't want to own my property with the government.
I won't, but some people may.
They may.
And I think for someone that is feeling hopeless, someone that thinks that there's no other choice, it may be a good platform for them to get into the market. And I think, out of all the things that the government wastes money on, this can only help. This can only assist. But as you said, the issue is not creating more demand. The issue is balancing that with supply.
Yes.
And that's why at the beginning of this conversation, your perspective as a developer coming from that industry and creating supply, those challenges aren't going to be addressed by Labor scheme, Liberal scheme, or whatever.
Correct.
There has to be some fundamental change in the way that we deliver this product.
And just on that, I think in terms of the supply side, I think government is doing a lot, and they're talking a lot about clearing the backlog or the red tape of planning, which is in fact talking about how they can increase supply. I think governments like to talk about planning a lot because it's cheap for them to actually implement. It's not a grant. It's not a concession or anything they need to pay into a project. So they look at planning as a way to reduce the red tape, which is absolutely an issue. But I think the larger issue, and probably something that government wouldn't want to address right now, is that feasibilities at the moment aren't stacking. And I think if government was to acknowledge that some projects are not going ahead because of feasibility, then there'd be a wider issue that the government would need to actually have to address.
Chris, last question, my favorite question. What have you learnt about yourself as a leader and also as an investor?
Look, I've got 4 kids myself as well, and run the business with 20 team members. I think for us to build a great company, you can't do it without having great people. And it's actually a conversation I had with some of our leaders recently that what we've done for the last 3 years is actually not going to make us win for the next 3 years. We need to be great people leaders for us to have success going forward. So I think for me, it's about bringing, and we're very protective of who we bring into the Coposit business. It's about making sure that we have great people. We nurture those people. We're able to give them a platform for them to grow personally and them to grow with us as a business. And we're all achieving common goals. We're highly transparent in our approach to the market. Maybe even speaking today, I'm pretty transparent with what we're doing and what my thoughts on government are and how we can help in that discussion. So for me, it's about attracting good people. And I think as a leader, my main role is to make sure that the good people are nurtured and brought through. And then when there aren't those great people with us, that we need to work on them and get them to a point where they can improve. So it's all about, for me, getting the people management side.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter.
All the best with your business, with your investments, and most importantly, your family. I'm sure your children are very proud of you. And I'm sure when they watch this episode, they'll be very proud of who their dad is. Thank you very much.
Thank you, mate. Appreciate
Thank
it.
you.